Okay, our next speaker is Hanna Kokko, who is an evolutionary ecologist and a professor at the University of Helsinki. Her interests span evolution, where she looks at adaptation within particular animals and species, and ecology, where she looks at the study of populations and contexts. One of her main research areas is in animal sexual selection, where she looks at the evolution of mating systems, sex roles, and parental roles. And another wing of her research explores ecological questions such as the social and spatial behavior of populations, the competition for breeding grounds and habitat choices, and thus she seeks to understand the link between individuals and population. I'm particularly eager to hear her lecture since one of her students' evaluations said, "The lecture did not give answer to all of life's questions," which was a shame. However, it was a good introduction. Hanna Kokko.
And thanks a lot for giving me the chance to speak here. I must admit that when I received the invitation, and the question was that I should review the history of future directions in the field of behavioral ecology, it actually made me ask, am I really a behavioral ecologist, and whether it should be me doing this here. The reason being that, okay, I have to admit that I've often been to behavioral ecology conferences, but I've also often been to evolutionary ecology conferences or ecology conferences. So I feel that there's certainly a part of me that is a behavioral ecologist, but at the same time, there's also a part of me that looks at the field from a slight outsider perspective. So that's where this schizophrenia comes from. But I think it also gives me a bit of a chance to both criticize the field and then also say things that I believe a typical behavioral ecologist would say when they then are trying to defend the field. So hence this weird title here. And of course, you know, this being the sort of conference that it is, we have to start with Darwin. And by the time November of this year, it's kind of hard to find a picture of Darwin that wouldn't have been overused very much already, so this is my attempt here. He actually, when you read the origin, he doesn't use the word behavior. It's almost impossible to find it except in one or two totally trivial contexts. He talks about instincts though, and there's a whole chapter on them actually. It is actually an interesting question why the entire this year's volume of behavioral ecology, if you look at all the abstracts, the word instinct doesn't appear there once. So there has been a great shift, and that's an interesting one to discuss later. But what Darwin says is that it will be universally admitted that instincts are as important as corporate structures for the welfare of each species. Under changed conditions of life, slight modifications of instinct might be profitable to a species. And by the way, when it comes to about the levels of selection that Darwin was thinking about, I think when you read the whole book, it's quite clear that he was thinking about individual level selection, but certainly he wasn't minding his language when he was talking about things like that. Probably because he was never prompted to. It's interesting to see how he might have changed his language if he had been. But anyway, if it can be shown that instincts do vary ever so little, then I can see no difficulty in natural selection preserving and continually accumulating variations of instinct to any extent that was profitable. It is thus, as I believe, that all the most complex and wonderful instincts have originated. So Darwin suddenly saw no difficulty at all at applying the natural selection thinking to behavior, to traits as variable over time as behavior. And as has been shown repeatedly during this meeting already, in very many topics he got very far without knowing anything about genetics at all. What happened later, this is stuff that has been already discussed here. The initial reaction to the recovery or rediscovery of what Mendel found was a decline in the value of Darwinian thinking, which only later, in the modern synthesis, we found this reconciliation of these two ideas. I'm not going to go into that because during this time, behavior really didn't seem to play a major role in the development of evolutionary thinking at all. So somebody like Wright, when he was labeling the axes of the fitness landscapes, there's nothing behavioral in there. There's actually nothing about specific traits at all in there. It is true that Haldane was talking about jumping into the river, and Fisher was thinking a little bit about sexual selection or mimicry and certain things like that. But incredibly few field studies, and certainly not a central theme behavior there. So what then happened was ethology, and I draw the timeline in a slightly different way here, because it really seems to have been originated in a relatively independent way from all of what has happened before. I mean, these people, they clearly were thinking evolutionarily, but there's pretty much nothing in their writings which would tell us that they had any impact in their thinking from the modern synthesis. They certainly didn't read equations. They don't cite this work. They do think about evolution, but they hardly cite Darwin either. So what was driving them was actually a slightly different question, and actually it was Nico Tinbergen there on the right, who even was the first one to actually say that we as biologists very clearly use different kinds of questions to answer questions about why is this trait there, what does it do? So Nico Tinbergen was the one who introduced the famous 4 why into biology, that we can be interested in the function of a trait, essentially asking questions about adaptation. What is it for? We can be asking about its phylogeny. We can be asking about the very proximate mechanisms, causation, or we can be interested in the ontogeny, the development of it. And just to make it a bit more concrete, this is actually the example that Wikipedia uses if you nowadays go and check what's there. The phenomenon that humans, when they grow up together with typically siblings, but could be any kid really that seems to be part of the family, as adults they have lack of sexual interest in these. So the function is to discourage inbreeding. Inbreeding would be bad for you, so you avoid it. The phylogeny, well, this is not a human unique trait at all. It's found all over. There are exceptions to this rule, but certainly it is a much older trait than just appearing in humans. When it comes to the proximate reasons, actually, we don't know very much about this, specifically in humans at least. And the development, we know very clearly that this can be sort of manipulated in experiments, if you like. The famous Kibbutz studies where unrelated children, they grow up in very family-like circumstances, so the same trait is said to develop there. I think there has been some criticism of these studies as well, but this is Wikipedia. Behavioral ecology, I think is defined, well, not really defined, but a typical behavioral ecologist tends to have the trait of finding the function question much more important and at least interesting than the others. The 4 whys, they are of course not really alternatives to each other. We cannot really say that one of them should rule. We cannot say that one of them can be falsified in favor of the other, but we can make, at least personally, people make statements about which one they find more interesting. Well, back to the timeline here. Ethology was actually very much concerned with not so much the function as modern behavioral ecology would be. To some extent they were debating that as well, but the evolutionary thinking there got sometimes actually quite wrong. Konrad Lorenz, for example, was talking about intraspecific aggression and ritual fights as something that evolves because it limits the damage to conspecifics and therefore makes the species work better. He was, of course, writing a little bit before this whole thing came to its head, when Wynne Edwards was talking about his actually very animal behavior-oriented book, where crows, for example, they come together to roost so that they can estimate their population sizes and refrain from breeding if it looks like overpopulation is a threat. Then this was such an explicit statement about the role of group selection that it prompted the counter arguments by Williams and Hamilton. But it is quite interesting that this is actually repeating what we heard yesterday, that it was really the particular examples that created behavioral ecology that more or less caused the shift towards starting to look at particular adaptations rather than the very general theory of adaptation. Now the rest is almost history. There has been a vast number of researchers who nowadays work on this topic, too many to mention by name. And also you can ask whether this has diverged in such ways that different journals contain different subfields that maybe even detrimentally to don't talk to each other very much. So we have evolutionary biology such as, for example, the general evolution. We have behavioral ecology, and whether these two things are really parts of the same field or something subtly different, that's something I'm going to talk about. But before that, a typical behavioral ecology study. What is really the approach that I'm talking about here? There's a quote again about brood parasitism, that there are some birds occasionally lay their eggs in the nests of other birds. In this case, as with that of the morathris or cuckoo, I can see no difficulty in natural selection making occasional habit permanent. As you might have guessed already, this is again Darwin, so no difficulties. Brood parasitism is intriguing. It's no wonder that a great naturalist such as Darwin starts asking, how come ever natural selection could produce something so wonderful? And I think this is very typical of behavioral ecology. It's very much natural history driven still in the age of genomics. You go out, you see something, you start asking why on earth. And the fact that cuckoos do something is nowadays also linked to the fact that their host species do something. It is pretty clear that it would be nice not to have to feed the cuckoo, who in the worst case might eject all your own eggs from the nest. So why don't hosts reject the eggs? So what one starts saying is that, well, perhaps natural selection hasn't had any means to create the optimal response or the best possible response to the situation. Maybe they just can't tell. Or even if they can tell that one egg looks different from the other, they haven't figured out how to do anything about it. But it could be that rejection is actually possible, but it's not so easy to do perfectly. It requires, first of all, that you start feeling very suspicious about certain eggs. And if you have such a tendency that maybe sometimes you make type 1, type 2 errors and you start rejecting some of your own eggs. Or it could be that the act of throwing eggs outside is actually quite detrimental. It might attract the attention of predators, or you might break your own eggs while you do that. Now, if you believe that something like this or that is true, then you have made a statement that this is a trait that natural selection can adjust. If parasites are more common, then maybe you will evolve to become more suspicious. And this is an idea that people then would like to test. So Nick Davies, who is one of the founding fathers of behavioral ecology, recently wrote a book about this whole subject and says that, well, experimentally, of course, we'd like to do much more than we actually can. For example, we would like to free the birds of parasitism, entire populations, for, let's say, a couple of hundred years, and then see what happens. Of course, this is not very easy to do, but he's sort of tongue-in-cheek man, so he says that, well, sure, we have actually done this experiment. And this actually did amaze me, because yesterday slave trade was mentioned in Andrew's talk. I don't know if you remember, but that was the fact that it brought the Drosophila to another continent, and then nowadays we can then see what happened as a result. So slave trade didn't just transport Drosophila, it also transported birds. And what happened was the following. In Africa, there's a brood parasitic cuckoo species called the Diderot cuckoo. This is one of its host species. The host is something that's quite easy to keep in a cage. It looks pretty and so on. So it actually, together with the slaves, was transported to, in this case, Hispaniola, where it actually went feral and formed new populations. The cuckoos, of course, didn't follow. So we have had a couple of hundred years of such an experiment going on. So people then have gone and looked at what has happened as a result. So in the African birds, you find that they really are very, very suspicious of anything that goes into their nests, up to 93% rejection rate. So this is done experimentally. You put something in there and basically see what happens. It's too slow for you to actually wait for the cuckoos to do their job. And then you perform the same sort of experiment in the new populations and figure out that it's an incredibly much lower rejection rate. So these people then, this is a fairly old study from the 80s, also said that one could predict that now through time the rejection of foreign eggs will become more prevalent again. Why do they say that? Because at the time when they were performing these experiments, it was precisely when a new root parasite was invading, this time from the south. This is a South American bird species, also uses these nests, and there were just the first records of this happening when they were conducting these experiments. So this is a prediction, and about 10 years later, some other people actually went there and they tested this again, and they found an incredibly high rejection rate. So, cool story, but of course it's a bit complicated. Because they produced a microevolution model. I mean, this is 10 years in a relatively, well, not really long-lived organism, but compared to Drosophila, certainly long-lived. And even if you assume the biggest possible detrimental effect of the cuckoos and perfect heritability and things like that, this change is too fast. It shouldn't be able to occur. So therefore, they concluded that, well, even if there's some genetics involved, this could also be explained possibly by a learning response, things like imprinting on your eggs. Now there's a new spatial study, the spatial in the sense of going to different areas in Hispaniola, looking at the current density of cowbirds and the frequency of parasitism. So once again, they end up favoring an imprinting-like process there. Now, what do we learn from this? There's actually quite a lot of points. Firstly, this is very definitely not a model species. You find that there's like one study every 10 years. Given that this is actually a very cool system of possible contemporary evolution, why doesn't everybody go there and rush and try to figure out what's going on? I think the reason is that there's so many cool things out there once you go to nature that we just run out of people doing this. So we end up with a situation where we actually, it's kind of frustrating. Very cool stories. In the end, we don't really know, is it this or is it that, and exactly how does this learning process work anyway? Why would you imprint so much more reliably to eject foreign eggs when these foreign eggs are common, given that most birds are naive, and couldn't you just imprint on the wrong type and so on? There's been no modeling here to really, it's just a verbal argument at this stage. Also, if you want to be kind of really nasty, you could say that, if I had started this study, not talking about slaves and kind of exciting things like that, and just said, what if I present this sort of data and how much faith do you have that this is really happening? You would probably say that, well, you would probably have started with a much more negative attitude. But of course, I mean, this is also the case that applies to the wonderful Drosophila example of yesterday that was using much more modern methods than artificial eggs. And I guess the point here is not so much to be super critical about every possible study that does this, but just to say that the more closely we go to what's actually happening in nature, then we have to accept that sometimes something like slave trade that we definitely don't want to replicate might actually provide some opportunities. But we could discuss what to make of that. Behavioral ecology as a whole is very characterized by these very opportunistic research methods, quite inventive actually when people have to design this sort of robotic crab and this sort of mirrors in fish tanks and so on, depending on what their study species allows. There's certainly, even though this particular example had a microevolution model in there, there's more emphasis on the ecological influences than genetics. A typical behavioral ecologist doesn't really like learning too much about genetic constraints. I think that's fair to say. And also the progress, which is kind of frustratingly slow, at the same time occurs on very many different fronts, and that's a thing that I will actually get back to. So how satisfactory is this really? Just a quote from these cuckoo studies that I'm actually in no way picking on, which I hope is clear by now. It's likely to have a genetic component, but the whole thing could just be a result of phenotypic plasticity. This is from the very newest paper on this subject, so we're a bit uncertain about what's going on. So that leads me to this quote that is the title of my talk. Behavioral ecology is the soft underbelly of evolution biology. And I put this anonymous there because I read this quote somewhere. I actually know who it is by. I emailed this person asking, in what context did you actually make it and what did you actually want to say? And he replied with this incredibly embarrassed email saying that I actually wish I wasn't associated with that, and I kind of regret saying that because it's so easily misunderstood. And of course, by telling you this, it makes you only more eager to Google. So well, I kind of promised not to emphasize his name here, so there you go. But I think the criticism is a valid one in many cases. But then there is the question of this, evolutionary biology, behavioral ecology. What is it that actually makes behavioral ecology so distinct? For example, this cuckoo story in particular, it happened, some parts of it were published in evolution, some parts of it were published in behavioral ecology. So is it part of the same story of investigation or is it not? So one hypothesis that you could state is that perhaps there's no difference really. Behavior is just one particular type of trait, and it gets published in behavioral journals simply to help people interested in behavior find it there. And if you're studying some morphometric trait, then you maybe go to another journal. Or then you could think about behavioral ecology really having some sort of a distinct culture and set of accepted methods or things like that. So I actually performed an experiment in the style of Darwin, if you start thinking about it. Just try to provide some data on the subject. So I chose 100 papers, 25 from behavioral ecology in 2000, just went through one issue like that, or in 2009, the same for evolution 10 years ago or now. And I also got a co-author who will be writing this chapter with me, and I presented him with titles only and asked him to categorize. Which one do you think is in behavioral ecology? Which one do you think is in evolution? So if you have a paper on the evolution of dispersal and altruism in aphids, and you have knowledge of the title only, what do you think? If you have cryptic female choice in the yellow dungfly, you can try to form your guesses here. Breeding systems, climate, and the evolution of migration in shorebirds, or colonies as byproducts of community selection, commodity selection. Also, he's a very honest man, so if he actually knew a particular paper, I believe he was honest enough to tell me. What the remaining data show is that he got the journal 85% correct. He got the year not terribly well correct, so you can start asking about whether there's progress in the field. But it is interesting that one is, based on these kind of things, one has experienced enough researcher has a feeling of what goes where. Yesterday we heard about how developmental biologists and evolution biologists talk to each other, and I think this is just the most summed up version of it. This is actually a story that somebody told me who had a flatmate who was that person, and this person was over there. And for 2 years they had this fight going on, and they never ever managed to get anywhere with it. Why is this? And I think for the rest of the talk, I'm going to do quite a lot of opinionated hand-waving. It's hard to prove these kind of claims, but it seems to me that behavioral ecologists, they do love the function Y so much that they actually make life quite hard for themselves. They have to go into nature, they have to try to answer all kinds of things about this trait with very limited knowledge about anything such as genetics, partly because they really don't use model systems very much. Also, the answers are definitely sought using an assumption that natural selection will, over long periods of time anyway, optimize whatever you're looking at. Maybe not in so much over the 10 years of the potential microevolution change in the cuckoo and cowbird story, but over longer periods certainly. And as you know, this of course is an assumption that has been criticized heavily. The very, very famous paper by Gould and Valentin. I could have drawn a picture of these spandrels of San Marco and so on. I think you all know what it is about, that many traits, they don't really have a functional explanation, and it's nonsense to try to look for one. The armchair picture is there just to remind me to say that the reason why this is such a hurtful argument to receive, or blame to receive, is that it's kind of like armchair biology. You just say that, oh, I see a trait, and surely it must be like this, and let's collect some data to support it, and you're making your life a bit too easy. Now, behavioral ecologists haven't really, well, they have responded. I know there's an author in the audience here who has responded in a very funny way by writing a sort of, well, I'll let David describe that himself at some point. So you can criticize this as well, but I think the real response by behavioral ecologists has been somehow a bit different. And this is just my view on what's happening, because they don't really cite anything like Karl Popper. But I think a very big response that is quite evident in the literature is that we try to create hypotheses that we can then falsify, and therefore answer these kind of things by saying that, yeah, but look, we are doing real science because we have all these different scenarios and we are testing between them. Now, of course, Popper is somebody whose views on science have been to some extent revised anyway, but still in behavioral ecology, I think the central question very often is phrased like, is this trait designed to do this particular thing, or is it designed by natural selection, of course, to do some other kind of thing? So I don't ask you to read all this, but this is just to show what sort of phrases you find in behavioral ecology, the journal, over time. So in the 1990s, there were still things like, how does this or that relate to something else, and does the distribution of something reflect the spatial scale of something else? So very not so much particular hypothesis falsification driven. In 2000, it's much more common already to find this kind of harm to offspring hypothesis, although this kind of text, these are from the abstracts, typically, these kind of things still lump together. In 2009, you find an incredible proliferation of different hypotheses, this and that. So there's a food-domain hypothesis, age-related improvements that can be explained by selection constraint or restraint hypothesis. It's not all bad to do this. It's only an attempt to clarify thinking. At the same time, this kind of writing, it can prompt a lot of criticism as well. When you look at these things like high tanning hypothesis, it's quite unclear how does it actually relate to any sort of bigger picture. So if you study lots of idiosyncratic questions, then you display relatively little in generalizing. And my co-author is somebody who is pretty much an expert on meta-analysis as well. So if you try to get your meta-analysis information from these kind of studies, you're certainly making life quite hard for yourself. Overemphasis on novelty, lack of replication. And now all of this is something that I'm not telling here as 100% truth. For example, there are topics, there are bigger themes that people try to answer, sex ratio theory, whether relatedness has something to do with helping behavior and so on. Once there's enough, then people actually can get enough data on, for example, meta-analysis purposes. But still, lots of different hypotheses, and that then get falsified, maybe some of them as a bit of a straw man. Even when you mention that your hypotheses are mutually exclusive, you discuss them as if they weren't really, and then relatively little interested in the other why questions. Now, for example, with the mutual exclusion thing, and I'm maybe changing tone here a little bit to try to become a bit more defensive, and just to get sidetracked for just a brief moment, to follow I mentioned that I work in ecology as well, and some developments that have happened there are maybe telling about the difficult process, but process anyway, where people do think that it doesn't have to be either or anymore, and maybe take a slightly more mature approach. So yesterday we were talking a lot about the neutral model. Ecology has its own neutral model that basically says that biodiversity, the number of species that an area can contain, it can be explained without assuming any intrinsic differences between the species. And the opposing hypothesis there is the niche hypothesis. And then these guys come up with an idea that maybe it's a bit of a continuum. So instead of being fundamentally opposed, these theories could simply be located at the extremes of this. So they present a model of recruitment probabilities that combines both niche and neutral processes. And somehow that actually is very similar to what we heard yesterday, that maybe we shouldn't talk so much about, the percentages of neutral versus selection. We know that there's a bit of both. We do have to try to estimate which one is more important in some sense, but the sort of very strict classification that it has to be that, or a number of cases fall into this or that category probably is pointless. And, thumbs up. Oh, that was surprising. Okay, I will present this. So when you, I need to correct my thoughts a bit. This is just a statistical metaphor for what people try to do when they study something unusual. So if you simulate something, let's say that you have got a very computer-intensive simulation. You could try lots of different values and then see what happens. You get simultaneously an idea of the variance of what's happening there, but also a bit of the shape of what is going on there. You could, of course, take the alternative approach, which is actually what experimental biologists do very much, that you look at this thing here, look at that particular value there, and then replicate lots so that you get more statistical confidence there. And it has actually been pointed out that if you do that, then of course you risk that you're actually not examining the whole parameter space, and you end up not finding at all what you were looking at. So this point has been made in statistical modeling. But I think as a metaphor, it could also apply to things like whether we actually do force everything to be a model system, and therefore we can actually have all the genomic tools we like. We can do brilliant studies, understand it with much, much greater power what is going on there. Or we could then also say that, well, maybe we could be a little bit like what Darwin did. He was studying all kinds of quirky things in nature, trying to fit them to a very kind of more general framework. Not only to let all the existing diversity inform us, but also to avoid the danger that all the model species out there could be a weird outlier. So, of course, the danger then is that, you know, any one particular study here, the believability of that might be a bit debatable, like with the cuckoos and things like that. You don't really yet know what is going on, but you do then find all kinds of weird examples. Here's a grasshopper that turns blue, very bright blue, when it gets warmer. And because I'm out of time, I think I'll leave some text there for you to read.